Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine.
Good.
Still looking for a peace agreement by somebody, a true one. But we have one that we can't quite trust yet. you know, it's going to be a peace and prosperity deal between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty good idea. I wonder if they're going to be using our advice on coming up with this treaty. But anyway, Trump is very excited about it. Nobody else has been able to put it together like this, and this is going to help the Palestinians and make peace for Israel, and everybody's going to be happy. You know, one thing that I found interesting is that the United States was very much involved in it.
Oh, yeah.
When two people are at war with each other and there's a contest, it seems like they should settle their dispute. But this was settled by the United States. I would say it's 98% United States. And it also is on the same day that Netanyahu was indicted for three charges against him, which is unique for Israel. They've never had a prime minister indicted. So that was not done by accident, I don't believe. But the big question is this treaty going to be helpful? And if you go by the leaders of the Palestinians, none of them like it.
Yeah.
And even the independent sources are saying it's not worth anything. It's dangerous. And it looks like even a well-known Jewish newspaper from Israel is saying that it's terrible. It won't work. So there's going to be a lot of noise, and there'll be a failure. And we do want to talk about it, why we strongly oppose it, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It makes things a lot worse for the Palestinians, and they've been in bad shape for a long time. And it seems like they get very few supporters in the Middle East. There are 3 countries that sort of showed up and gave token support for the Palestinians over this issue, but it's not going to be settled easily. This is not going to settle it. It's going to make it a lot worse. There is severe mistreatment of the Palestinians from my viewpoint, and of course, in general, we would argue the case that problems like this should be settled by the people who are having their fight, and it should be local, and the outsiders shouldn't be involved. But that's not been the case. The Palestinians have been involved in outsiders messing around with that area ever since World War II, and it hasn't gotten better for them. It always gets worse.
Yeah, the key, I think, problem with this deal of the century is that the Palestinians weren't involved in it. They weren't involved in creating it. Trump is a real estate developer. He should understand that, you don't make a real estate deal by saying, here's an apartment, buy it.
Right.
Both sides are involved in the process. So it's a 180-page document. It's got carrots and sticks. Apparently the carrots are all designed by Kushner, the president's son-in-law, a well-renowned expert in Middle East affairs. It does remind me a little bit of the Freedom Act versus the Patriot Act, if you remember, because remember the Patriot Act came out and it did a lot of horrible, illegal things, and the Freedom Act, the reform of the Freedom Act, just made those illegal things legal. And that's kind of what this thing does. It basically keeps Palestine the same situation of tiny little enclaves, but it just legalizes the whole thing and puts that over. But I think everything can be seen just in the optics of it. You see President Trump meeting with the current Prime Minister of Israel and the opposition leader, and the 3 of them present it rather than even having a Palestinian present to present it. So it certainly has the look of, hey, here's a deal, like in The Godfather, an offer they can't refuse, that sort of thing.
Well, it looks like they're not even pretending that there will be a 2-state solution to this ever, or offer it. They've essentially eliminated that. A couple former prime ministers of Israel came out against it, which means that there are some independent thinking people there as well. And this is something that is not going to be settled. I think when artificial situations are concerned, the people who are being abused never give up. And the Palestinians aren't going to give up. But what it does, it drives them to be more desperate. And I think overall, I think there'll be more violence. I think there's going to be if they want to defend what they believe is their own, they will be called terrorists. And if you defend your homeland or you defend some sovereignty, that you're a terrorist, no matter how obvious it is of the overbearing of the outsiders. But this is going to be hyped up. It certainly has been hyped up. The deal of the century, the greatest. But sometimes those words are going to run flat, especially when they don't work out too well.
Yeah, and of course we have enormous sympathy for European Jews after World War II and what happened to them in Europe. There's no question about it after the Nazi Holocaust. And they certainly deserve to have a place where they're free. But the Palestinians didn't do it. The Germans did it, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's if we look at the first map, this kind of shows the history since the creation of the State of Israel and what's happened to Palestinian land. You can see on the left, historic Palestine, and then in 47, and then in 67 after the war. And then the last one, you'll see these tiny little enclaves. This is Trump's projected plan in 2020. So the difference is pretty stark when you see what happened to the Palestinians. And we can actually look at the second one too, because this is actually from Trump's plan that shows the kind of state that it will be. And all of these roads, of course, are all controlled by Israel, all of the border crossings, and these are all connected by tunnels and roads. So it's hardly what you would think of when you think of a state. And in fact, as Haaretz points out, the Israeli newspaper points out, the whole hype that this gives the Palestinians a state is not true. It gives the possibility of a state in 4 years, but the state would look like the map that we showed, and that is hardly a state. A couple of the features of it, it gives Palestinians the power to govern themselves, but not the power to threaten Israel, is the opening line. They have to completely demilitarize. The Palestinians have no right to military or diplomatic activity without Israel's approval. Israel controls all crossings into Palestine, so it's hardly what you would consider a sovereign state.
And it looks like some of these developments where Israel just went in and built homes, the settlements on the West Bank, they're just going to take them back, and it's going to be part of Israel. It's interesting also that Trump has bragged about his willingness to cut foreign aid to the Palestinians. I don't like foreign aid. Nobody should get foreign aid. Yeah. But when you use it as a weapon on somebody that really has nothing anyway, you know what they're obviously up to. But the foreign aid was cut, which should be cut, but it should be cut from everybody. Maybe the fact that the other side gets some more foreign aid than anybody else is part of our problem.
Yeah, that's true. And back to the Haaretz article again, which is a liberal Israeli paper, but it just shows that there is quite a bit of discussion in Israel. They point out under this new plan, the streets of all cities, towns, and villages, as well as the roads connecting them in this new state of Palestine, will be under full control of Israel. No border controls for the Palestinians, all for the Israelis. The enclaves have no territorial continuity. The Palestinians are still going to be stuck at the crossings and at the checkpoints, but this time it'll be, okay, you're within your own country, but you're still stuck for hours in a checkpoint. Haaretz says it creates two sets of rules, one for Israeli Jews and one for Israeli Arabs. And the Israeli Arabs, who now, of course, have Israeli citizenship, they'll lose that citizenship and the minimal rights that come with it. So there's a lot of sticks. We'll talk about a couple of the carrots. That's Kushner's idea. And I think if you believe the promises, I think you could talk to the Native Americans about the promises that are provided in these kinds of things. But they promise 1 million new jobs, billions in investment. It's going to be a high-tech corridor in Palestine and this sort of thing. So a lot of big promises, but a lot of sticks involved as well.
During the presidential campaign, in one of the debates, this subject came up, and they talked about, do you believe the Palestinians are a non-people? I really never had heard this before, but it was so astounding to me. Well, how could they be a non-people? But there was one candidate defended us. He says, "Oh yeah, they're non-people." But that would explain everything that they do.
Yeah.
They're not really people, and they look at them this way, and they deserve nothing about their historic defense of where their families have lived, and for not 100 years, hundreds of years, some of the Palestinians have lived in these areas, and they're getting rooted up. So it should strike at the hearts of people who want to be fair, with everybody, but it doesn't seem like this is helping. This is going to make it much, much worse. It's going to be an apartheid system, but unfortunately, it's not going to get the sympathy that the apartheid system got, in South Africa.
Yeah, and I'll go back to it again because it was a great article. Here's the you think about, okay, is it going to be accepted? What's going to happen? Oh, the Palestinians are going to reject it by design, maybe, perhaps.
All
but
right.
Here's what Haaretz says, and I think this is pretty clear-headed analysis. The chance that any Palestinian leader agrees to accept such a state under these conditions is non-existent. What the Trump plan is offering the Palestinians is basically to take the existing reality, living under Israeli military occupation, with settlements spread in between their cities, towns, and villages, and to enshrine it by labeling it a state. For the Palestinian citizen, this would still mean living in a territory that is fully controlled by Israel, but one where one group of the population enjoys all the rights and benefits that come with Israeli citizenship, while the other, larger group is under military control.
Yeah, the odds of that happening, though, are so slim. It's so tragic of what's happening that that's why I predict that there's going to be a breakout of violence, of some sort, because it's so unfair to what is happening. And these treaties have been going and coming for years, but this is the most aggressive, I think, of the destruction of any hope that there would be a sovereign state for the Palestinians. But this whole thing, the maps that you show, it's just not practical. I mean, it'd be sort of like somebody took us over and they gave us 4 or 5 states all scattered around the United States. But we're in charge of the United States now, but a couple of you can live there. And that's not very practical. But I don't think that they're expecting it to be practical. I think maybe the only practical thing they want is for the Palestinians to be looked as bad people, and that they've turned it down. We gave him the best deal ever, and more benefits than any other time ever. And then they'll say, Palestinians, they won't work with us for a peace treaty, and that'll be said in American media. It'll be said, in the rest of the world too, probably.
And we know that the Palestinian leadership has been notoriously corrupt, and part of the reason is because they're propped up by U.S. foreign aid to a large degree, which corrupts people. So any money that comes in, is going to go in people's pockets. It's not going to go to help the average people there who are suffering. But, I think if we step back and look at the context of this big presentation of Trump and the 2 Israeli leaders and the opposition leader, as you point out, Netanyahu was indicted in corruption charges. He's facing a tough election. President himself is embroiled in an impeachment process that is, at least theoretically threatening him. So this is sort of the context of rolling out this big plan. Maybe it's a diversion. Maybe it's meant to help Netanyahu, who's been very close to President Trump. President Trump has done, I think, a lot of his bidding, moving the embassy, declaring Jerusalem as completely Israeli, and sort of everything that he's wanted, the occupied Golan Heights, saying, no, that's Israeli territory. So it does not look like the U.S. is playing the role of an honest broker. And the question is, why are we a broker at all?
Yeah, that's for sure.
If you remember, we had Nassim Taleb on the show, and he said, I think if the U.S. had not gotten involved in it, the Israelis and the Palestinians would have already had an equitable deal. Trade, commerce, those sorts of things would have taken over, and they would have relative peace.
Now, as a consequence of this so-called agreement, the Palestinians said, well, we might just get out of the Oslo Accords. They must then think that the Oslo Accord afforded them a little bit of an edge, that they were seeing that they had some self-government. So if they get out of that and reject that pretense, they're actually saying, well, why should we be in some accord that's guaranteeing us a little bit of self-defense self-government, and we don't have it. So I guess their point is that even the Oslo Accord is a farce. If they pass this, they're rejecting that, and just makes the whole situation that much worse.
Yeah, well, I think, to conclude, I think if we're ready to do it, I think Trump is bungling his way through the Middle East. I think he has a big constituency in the U.S. A lot of evangelicals feel very passionately attached to Israel, and I think he's hoping maybe that will help him in the election coming up. But, he's lighting a lot of brush fires that may turn into big conflagrations. The best thing for us to do would be not get involved, not stirring up the Iranians by killing their generals, stirring up the Palestinians. It's not going to provide anything safe for the Israelis, and I think that's why we're seeing newspapers like Haaretz saying, hang on, this is not a great idea, because they're the ones that have to live with the unrest that's caused by the U.S. being really not a fair actor in this process. So, again, Dr. Paul, we're broken records here. The best solution is non-intervention for the U.S. to pull back and certainly not try to take one side over the other.
Thank you. There was a vote I cast many years ago, and it was for a proposal to give Cardinal O'Connor a gold medal, which sounds good. He was a good guy, and but it was taxpayers' money, and I wanted to make the point that's not what we're here for, to give medals to people we think are good guys. So I voted against it, and by the time I got back to my office, some staffer, who knows, it might have been Daniel or somebody, they said, the New York Times wants to talk to you. They called in here, and they wanted to know, why would you vote against? Is your boss anti-Catholic? And whoever answered the phone said, no, he votes against, all gold medal. And I think about foreign aid. If somebody would never do it, but if they'd happen to do it, and I know because I've talked to them, they were tempted because they didn't like what Israel's doing. I'd like to vote against that foreign aid for Israel, but you can't do that. But what you want to do is look at the big principle of the principle of foreign aid is bad. Just look how ridiculous this impeachment is over the foreign aid, illegal foreign aid going to Ukraine. That whole thing is just so bizarre. But that's the way it is. The best way to deal with this and to fulfill a non-interventionist foreign policy is quit the foreign aid. We don't have the money. And I've often said, and I believe it's true, foreign aid is taking money from the poor people in this country and giving it to the rich people in poor countries, because it doesn't really help the people over there. This idea that we're going to tax the rich and help feed the poor and bring peace on the world, that is just not going to happen. It usually makes warring much worse, and that's the whole point about this. The foreign aid that we poured in there and taken a position that's only and always pro-Israel tends to, continue to stir and keep trouble, and the contest is there, and that's what it is. This is a result. We just need to stay out of it. And people say, well, you're a bunch of isolationists. You don't want to talk to the world. Exactly the opposite. We want to do it on different terms. We don't want to do it when we threaten people with sanctions and tariffs and war and drones and killing people, invading and getting involved in 100 and some countries with our CIA, telling them who they should have for leaders. I mean, there's so many benefits from it. I just wish people would take the quick look at this, and if they favor foreign aid to Israel, reconsider foreign aid to everybody. And it is a much more consistent policy, because that is a vote on principle, and it has nothing to do with some type of a prejudice. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.